Hi, folks. Welcome back to Inside the Songs. Today, I am very pleased to be chatting to a good friend of mine, Dom Brown, guitarist in Duran Duran and seasoned music industry vet from the UK, who's going to be chatting to me today about his work in the industry over the past, 30 years, Dom? How long have you been working professionally?
Professionally, probably 30 years, maybe slightly longer actually.
Yeah.
Just over 30.
So hopefully there's a lot that I can learn from you still.
Let's hope.
We'll see.
I can't guarantee that, but we'll try.
Well, we'll try our best. So let's start by talking about Duran Duran. You joined initially as a stand-in guitarist, and then over time you were adopted full-time as the lead guitarist. So tell us about that experience, how you got that gig, and how that transition period worked, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's quite a wild story actually. So it's actually 20 years this week. I'm actually playing tomorrow with Simon Le Bon at a private party. The same person, it was his 40th when I did my first show, and tomorrow's his 60th. And my band, Uncovered, are backing Simon at this party, which is quite a turnaround.
That's awesome. That sounds like great fun.
It's exciting, yeah. So, I mean, literally going back, it's bizarre that we've timed this like this. So literally 20 years and one day ago would have been, I remember it clearly, it was a Wednesday. And that was the day that I got a call in the morning, seeing if I was available 2 days later, that's 20 years tomorrow, to see if I was available to play with Duran Duran at this party. And I get a call from a friend of mine, a producer, Fraser Smith, who said to me that Duran looking for guitar players. It's all very last minute. Andy Taylor is pretty ill and not available for this show. So I get a call from him saying to me, if you're up for it, the tour manager will call you back in like the next half an hour. Just have a chat with him and see what you think. So put the phone down from Fraser. Phone goes. 20 minutes later, it's the tour manager. And he basically says, look, are you up for it? We've got a bunch of guys coming down tonight to try out for it. We're pretty desperate. And I said, sure, if I get it, when do we rehearse? He said, well, unfortunately, Simon Le Bon and Nick Rhodes are actually they're in Europe for promo. So you won't even meet them until the sound check in 2 days' time on the Friday, this gig. Well, okay, great. Okay. So I thought, anyway, it's a challenge. So that evening, that Wednesday evening, I went and met John Taylor and Roger Taylor, and straight away kind of clicked with them. I found them extremely friendly and just open to have me there, made me feel very relaxed. They basically just played some of their famous songs and asked me to play along with them on this first night. And some of the songs I'd heard most of their songs, but I'd never played a Duran Duran song in my life. So I'm kind of busking along with it, jamming. And obviously I did something right. I picked up the kind of the vibes and managed to sort of get straight into the pocket and stuff. And after a couple of hours of that, they said to me, look, if you're happy and you want to do the gig with us, I said, yeah, I'd love to. Can you go home with these 10 CDs? And they ticked off like 2 or 3 songs per CD and learn these songs for the next day. So the next day I then basically went home, stayed up most of the night, just listening, making notes, practicing, trying to work out a few sounds, got a few hours sleep, woke up the next morning, carried on for a few hours. Then after lunch, I went to the studio and met Roger and John again. And we then rehearsed those. It's about 18 songs it ended up being that just the 3 of us then rehearsed for that afternoon with no vocals, nothing. So it was all very, very, very challenging. And then the next day, met Simon and Nick at the sound check. And we basically had just enough time to kind of top and tail things. I'm literally asking Nick, I'm saying, sing me that riff. What's that opening riff for this next song? That kind of thing. And but what I didn't know was that they had a whole load of shows coming up. So this was like a test. So obviously they didn't want to commit to me until I'd done that first show, understandably, because it could have gone horribly wrong. But it went very well, thankfully. And literally that evening they said to me, can you come to America in a few days as like about, I think it's 3 or 4 weeks of shows over there. And I said, yeah, I'd love to. They said, right, we're going to make an appointment for the embassy. So I was like, next morning I'm at the embassy. They managed to somehow arrange it all. I think they'd already had it on hold, actually. Yeah, to go and get the visa. And so I sort of traveled along there at stupid o'clock and got the visa. And then, the next show, I'll tell you about that as well. That was also very underprepared with no rehearsals.
So it's a real kind of seat of your pants, baptism of fire kind of integration into that lifestyle.
Absolutely, yeah.
Wow, amazing.
No chance to get nervous, really. Actually,
no chance. And talking of charts, like they just gave you the records and they said learn it. You had no stems, no tabs, nothing like that. You were just listening to the record and doing your best to pick out the lines.
Absolutely, yeah. But I guess so. That's how I've always learned guitar, because I'm self-taught, and I've always learned it that way. But now it's easier. Now, when I'm working with Duran, they send me the stems, that the guitar parts and that kind of thing. So it's a lot easier, And obviously the songs I've played on the albums and stuff like that, obviously I've got to start with those ones. But
yeah. You'd like to think so anyway.
Yeah, and I don't really read music efficiently enough. And obviously, if I charted it all out, it's not very rock and roll to have a whole, So what I did do was like I'd have like a sheet of A4 paper with about 2 or 3 songs per sheet on the floor, just literally with things like for instance, like "Hungry Like the Wolf" always reminded me a bit of "Get It On" by T-Rex, Mark Bolan. So I just have Bolan riff in E for 8 bars, that kind of thing, or Nile Rodgers funk riff in E minor 7, that kind of thing. These are my little sort of markers, little prompts.
They're cues that obviously work to you and that you understand exactly what they mean to you. And they probably, to somebody else, they would be completely useless, but they work for you.
Absolutely useless to anybody else, because they wouldn't have that same reference and that same point of reference.
Yeah. So look, you've been playing with Duran for 20 years. So how, after doing something for that long and playing, obviously the repertoire changes a bit, but people still want to hear all the big hits. How do you keep it fresh from gig to gig, from tour to tour? How do you keep it exciting and not feeling like you're just playing the same stuff over and over?
Yeah, so you're not going through the motions. Absolutely, because that's the worst thing. I mean, if I felt like I was going through the motions, I wouldn't be able to keep doing it, because I love music. I guess with Duran, you've got an advantage. Well, any big established band that have a huge fan base, before we even play a note, the energy from the audience when you walk on stage, it's just electric, So you're already getting that kind of elates you and gives you that buzz. And for me, I mean, I try and, well, I certainly feed from the audience. So I'm always checking out who's there, people I recognise, and then I get a kind of rapport going with a few of the fans, people that come to regular gigs. You get this kind of eye contact thing going. So that kind of keeps it fresh a bit. And it's very uplifting music as well. So it's quite hard to get bored, because every song is pretty much up and, as I say, uplifting and very, very exciting songs.
Dancing music, isn't it? It's fun, good vibes.
It is. I mean, obviously there's some really beautiful ballad things like "Ordinary World" or "Save a Prayer." Those two of my favourites, actually. But they're uplifting, even though they're not dancey. There's something about them, very positive songs, and just I think two of their best songs. Definitely two of my favourites, and also songs like "The Chauffeur." That it's more of the kind of a fan type song, but that's got quite a dark thing to it. But again, I still find that there's something about that's it's just very powerful. It kind of makes me feel really great when I play that one. But in terms, I mean, it's not like a blues. Obviously, it's not like a blues gig where you can sort of jam around. So I do have to stay pretty much to the structures and the riffs and stuff. And there are a few solos, and I do stick pretty much to the same thing, because that's kind of what you need in the pop bar, But I do, there's little things. I mean, I never play anything exactly the same twice, unless I'm sort of in the studio and I'm deliberately doubling something up, that I have to do that.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that if you listen to me, sort of one gig and then after 3 or 4 gigs later, things will be just the feel will be slightly different, but probably only I would know, or the producers would know. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
The average fan's not going to know that. But
do you think that ethos of yours, is that mirrored across the band? I mean, is there, for example, with lots and lots of touring bands, whether they're as experienced as Duran or new, lots of bands have stuff on tape these days. It's very common. Is that something that Duran do, or is everything live?
No. To be fair, no, they do have some of the strings are on, because I mean, there's a huge. When I say strings, I mean keyboards and that kind of thing. There's huge, especially in the later stuff, staggering amounts of stuff that would be impossible for Nick Rhodes to pull that off live. So there's quite a bit of keys on track. and which then means Roger plays to a click. So that's kind of what I'm saying about it's not like a blues thing where there's a lot of freedom. It is very specific,
You can't just go off on a 2-minute jam in the middle because there's cues coming up.
Exactly. No, that's definitely not possible. And I do like that side of things, but for a band like Duran, it's all, they're trying to recreate the studio sound as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
They need a certain amount of that on tape. But what goes above that, what sits on top of that is quite raw. The guitars and Simon's vocals and, the bass and everything and the BVs and, they can move around a bit, enough to keep me interested.
Yeah. And I suppose looping back to the question about, how you keep it fresh and exciting, that's part of it, having the ability to, and the license to do things slightly differently each time.
Yeah.
It makes it not a clinical experience. You still feel like a musician up there playing, not like a backing track,
Absolutely. Yeah. But obviously you can't go off too far. If I suddenly change the guitar line, it's going to throw people off and the fans will be like, what's actually going on?
What is that? What is that?
I don't know this song.
Because that's another thing as well. People come to the shows and they have a very clear expectation of what they're going to hear. They know the songs. You're not a new band where you've got license to kind of do what you like. People want to hear the songs that they know so well. So
yeah. But I mean, just one thing though. Over time, obviously, I've integrated my style into the band. You can't help that. It's just so I play things differently to Andy Taylor or Warren Kikuulu, for instance. It's just. I mean, if I didn't do that, it wouldn't feel as good as it feels because it would be a bit fake. And things have evolved over the years. Like for instance, Ordinary World. Keep mentioning that song, but it is one of my favourites. And I've got a bit of a moment in there that's one of my favourite parts of the set, which is where it's kind of after the third verse, I think. After the third verse, I go into like a guitar thing, like a solo that isn't on the record, and that's something I developed and put into the mix, and that is now referred to a lot by fans to talk about that part of the song when they're talking to me, and I just look forward to playing that every night, and that's totally my thing there. Just managed to slot into 16 bars.
Yeah, and that's great that the OGs of the band have allowed you to integrate into the band so in such an important way that they're flexible to let the songs continue to grow, because I'm sure there would be other examples of musicians and bands where the songs are the songs and we play the songs like that, and they don't want them to develop because
absolutely exactly, which is just another thing, isn't it? I mean
I mean it's horses for courses, isn't it? It's there's never a right or a wrong way for people to do these things. There's just the way that people end up doing them.
It's just what works.
So you're probably most well known for playing with Duran these days, but you also do a lot of writing and co-writing with people like Mark Ronson, Nick Hodgson, very famously, lots of other very famous songwriters and producers. So can you talk to me about how you would approach a co-writing session, and especially perhaps how you need to adapt to different writers, different studios, different collaborative relationships and styles?
Yes, I mean, the main thing that I would say is whenever you sort of go into these different scenarios, it's to be open-minded. You've got to be open-minded and relaxed and open for suggestions and not taking things too personally if people don't like your ideas. I mean, I don't like to plan too far in advance, really, because I like things to be more organic and sort of flow at the moment. Saying that, if it's at my studio, like where I am now, Rockwood Studios.
Give it a good plug, Dom.
Rockwood Studios, guys. This is the place to be.
South London, Streatham.
Yeah, Southwest London, SW16. If it's at my studio, then I like to be set up and prepared. I like to, so that things can move as quickly as possible. I think that's important. So I'm not spending, 10 minutes setting something. I mean, obviously, if it's something extreme and something that you don't do regularly, then if it's worth spending 10, 15 minutes setting something up, then you do. But as much as possible, I'd like to have things kind of ready. I think that's important. And obviously, when I go into a different studio to work with people, I don't have that pressure of running my own. because there is a pressure, if you're running the ship,
Yeah, there is.
So,
I know that well myself. It's you always feel really panicked in a moment where somebody asks you to do something that you've never done before, and your brain just for a moment goes, "Crap, how do I make that work?" And once you've laid your finger on the process, you're like, "Okay, good, yeah, we're like this." But it is a challenge being in both producer, engineer, and co-writer / session player modes simultaneously, because they are two very different skill sets. So it's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it happened to me recently because I'm doing a project with John and Roger, Roger Taylor. It's a kind of it's a slow to slow to come to fruition, but I mean, it's a guitar-based thing. We've been doing some work here, some really good ideas. But for instance, they brought down an electronic Roland kit that I've never worked one of those, and so we had to set that up, and a few things were going wrong. Wasn't flowing as efficiently as I wanted, and I could tell Roger was probably getting a little bit, it's like edgy. He wanted to get on with them, do the playing, and that was a perfect example of what you're saying about feeling a bit panicky, But obviously, they're guys I've worked for 20 years, so it's not like it's some new person I'm trying to impress, And they're totally cool. They're totally cool. I mean, we got what we wanted at the end. It just took longer to get there because I had no experience with this piece of kit, that they turned up with. Things like that.
And it's even worse when you're on the clock with a paying client, right? If someone's paying there for you to produce them, and then there's a technical hiccup in facilitating their workflow, you feel awful, because it's like that in their heads they're like, come on, let's get this going.
Yeah, it's really intense, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, things like if I'm doing a session that will involve drums, I mean, I will, and this didn't happen back in the day, but with other scenarios, when I was renting a studio, for instance, you spend the first half day setting up the drums,
Yeah.
You spend the first 2 hours just miking up the snare drum. But what I like to try and do now, I think because of, that was 30 years ago, when I was making demos. But now everybody wants everything like this, bang, bang, bang.
Totally.
So what I'll do is I'll get in there the night before or an hour or two before the session starts, and I'll get the drums set up. And in theory, I mean, I'm not really getting paid for that, but it's part of the process, really. I'd much rather know that my drums, I've got them all there, they're sounding good before I start recording and writing with the client.
It depends on your process, doesn't it? But I know exactly where you're coming from, because, and in fact, I had this exact thing just this week. A client that I've worked with a number of times here in my studio, and they're sending me their schedule, their plan for the session that we had a few days ago. And they're like, yeah, one song with drums to record, that'll take an hour. Then we go on to guitar. Then I'm like, oh, hang on a minute. Like, we're doing drums, so we're going to need 3 hours, because you're going to need an hour to set up the drum kit and make sure he's comfortable, and an hour to mic and sound check, and then an hour to track and edit. Possibly less, but, give yourself all the time that you need. And they're like, oh, but, the previous times that we've come, the drum kit's been, all there and ready. I'm like, yeah, well, you've been lucky, because it happens to have been already set up from a session. But that's not a given. That's just that you've benefited from the fact it's already there. But in this instance, the drum kit is not going to be there, because I'm working with another drummer the day before. He's going to strip out, and then we're setting up from scratch. So, and they're like, oh, well, that feels a bit off. I'm like, it's not off. Like, that's the way a recording session would be. It's just that you've got really lucky the time before.
It's a time-consuming thing, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, obviously, if a client's bringing their own kit, then I'd have to do exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. But it's funny how people's expectations, perhaps over the last 20, 30 years working in studios, have changed. People would always traditionally understand that there's a lot of time in the processing of working in a studio, whereas now, because so many more people are working at home and workflows can be so much quicker, they always expect that to be transferable when they go into a real studio environment. They're like, now, instant.
And expect results like bang, bang, bang. Yeah. It's a whole different world.
Yeah. So continuing on the songwriting theme, let's talk about creative control, especially maybe advice for newer artists who are looking to develop or find or maintain their own voice or style. What advice would you give to people in that situation?
That's a very tricky one, isn't it? Because obviously, if you're the artist, you have the vision and you want to retain that vision as much as you can. And then as soon as you get involved with producers or other writers who are helping you complete your vision, you've got to compromise, haven't you? And that's a really difficult one, because it's like, you can never say how much somebody should compromise, because sometimes when you compromise, it turns out not as good as it would have been if you hadn't compromised. But I think it's important. Like I said before, I think it's the open mind. Being open-minded is very important. I guess if you've got if you're somebody very, 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 very intensely passionate about what you've written and what you want to do and what your direction is, then that's just, you're going to be constantly fighting that cause, aren't you? And it's probably about finding somebody who matches that goal. Actually, probably about finding the right producer who can help you reach that, and that you trust and that you admire and respect, and their advice you can see actually improves what you're doing. But finding that is not always easy, is it?
I do think that's great advice. Finding the person to work with that understands you, because to me, there's always this balancing act between creating something that people understand and that belongs to a community or whatever niche, versus having individualism and having something unique. And the advice that you receive on no, you need to be more like this to fit in here, versus no, you need to be more individual to stand out, will differ dependent upon who you talk to. So
of course, yeah.
You'll never get the same advice from different people.
No, exactly, because the producer or the label might think, wow, this guy or girl is very talented. They've got a great voice, but they need to be more like, this person who's just had a massive number one 10 weeks in the charts thing, But what they sometimes, you could miss what the uniqueness is of that artist, and they could have something that's equally as successful, but just different. And sometimes maybe it's a harder sort of path to go down, isn't it? Because you're kind of breaking new ground, I suppose.
Yeah.
It's a really very, very difficult area to revise on that.
I guess from my point of view, the best advice that I could give is listen to all of the advice and listen to all of the opinions, and don't be hard-headed about it, but do have faith in your artistry as well. Because somebody else doesn't understand what you're trying to achieve doesn't mean there isn't validity in what you're trying to do. But at the same time, people in the industry do have experience that is worth considering.
Being open-minded. Yeah, and I mean,
but it's hard, right?
Yeah.
There's not a quick fix, easy answer.
No, there's not, and it's just persevering and just finding that person, that partner who just you two click,
Yeah. Cool. So let's talk a bit more about session playing. Before you got the Duran gig, and perhaps even, I'm not quite sure when you sort of stopped doing sessions with other artists. You can tell me now, but you've played with everyone from Justin Timberlake to Paolo Nutini to Elton John, like a bunch of massive household names that people all around the world will know. What's the most important skill that you've had to have as a session musician in order to be able to adapt to the different musical styles, environments, artistic characteristics? How do you make those jobs stress-free?
Yeah, good question. Well, firstly, experience is an absolute must. Experience and versatility. My tastes are extremely eclectic. I listen to anything from jazz to heavy rock. I've listened to reggae, funk. I'm a massive blues player. Pop, and everything in between. And so studying all those styles helps, obviously, in the session world. If you want to be a sort of general player, some session players only do their one thing and they get hired for that one thing, but that's quite rare. But I mean, for me, I actually got into session playing relatively late. It was kind of like in my sort of late 20s when I started doing stuff, because in my teens and early 20s, I was doing my own stuff, my own solo projects, and I had a couple of bands, and we got to a certain level, small deals, but it never hit the big time. So, you get to your mid towards the end of your 20s, and you start thinking, you actually need to start living a bit more comfortably, So I carried on doing the solo stuff for quite a few years, but I started, at the time there were some session agencies that don't really exist anymore, I don't think. There's one in particular called Session Connection, and I was kind of on their books, and that was really good for me. That I got to meet a lot of people through that and work with a lot of big names. But that was a bit of a process, because so I sort of built up a name of being a sort of good player, do my own stuff, and I mean, when I was a city player, people would still ask me to do things, but it wasn't like on that big household name sort of type level. It was just around London and stuff. Various bands would get me to learn their stuff in very short timescales, and then go and do the shows and stuff. So when I first initially got into this session, it was through these agencies. A lot of it was actually it was great fun, but it was frustrating because a lot of it was kind of doing promo stuff for people. So for instance, like Elton John, for instance, I did a bunch of shows with them, but it was kind of, playback stuff. So,
right.
And obviously I could play all the parts, and, you have to learn it like you are performing it. There's a few of them like that. There's Lionel Richie as well. So these really big names, Rod Stewart. Those three, for instance, it was like very early on for me. It was a thrill of just being in their world, in their environment, playing these songs, even though but I was really frustrated. And I've got a little story about being backstage with Lionel Richie, actually. So I'd never played, live for any of these guys. I'm just jamming backstage, and Lionel, the loveliest man in the business anyway. We went on his private jet over to, I think it was Guernsey, I think it was. And that was, as I say, early on, so that's quite a thrill. Anyway, I'm just playing, just in my own little world. And he kind of came over, and he started chatting to me. He said, "Man, yes, it was very, very complimentary, and you're seriously good." And talking about, I'll be giving you a call if things don't work out, with his guitar player, who I think he's had for years. So it obviously worked. Mm-hmm. It's obviously worked out. But those sort of little things gave me confidence. And then slowly after a couple of years of doing that, I mean, I was constantly on all the, I did Top of the Pops probably 12, 15 times with different artists. Again, a bit frustrating because not all of it, but most of the time it was Miami. But you get to meet musicians and you have fun. It was a really good buzz. I'm so glad I did all that. And there's a lot of TV programs around that time that have gone now, like CD UK, and and the same guys would all meet every Saturday morning. There would be like the house band and stuff, playing all these different artists. And it was a lot of fun, but as I say, frustration, because I knew I could be the guy actually playing that stuff, and that's what I was playing. So I wanted to do that. So slowly these things started to evolve, and before I knew it, I was doing little tours and stuff. And one of my early ones was actually, I was the band called Go West. Probably heard of them. I got asked, again, it's only a couple of days' notice, I got asked to be the guitarist for the house band on that tour. And Go West were the house band, and that band played, so two main guys, obviously they only came on for their set at the end, but the rest of the guys, we backed up Nick Hayward, lovely man, and Ben Vaupierre from Curiosity Killed the Cat. So I had to learn 29 songs in 2 days. It's pretty daunting. And we had a sound check. That was the only rehearsal. But that paid huge dividends, because sort of word got around that I'd managed to pull that off. That, I think, led on to the Duran thing a couple of years, maybe about 2 years later. That would have been a year or two later. So various things like that. I did a tour with the Appletons, the All Saints girls, did a tour with them I say tour, I worked with them for a year. We did a small tour, we did the Fee festivals and loads of full live TV shows. That was interesting because at the time Nicole was married to or partners with Liam Gallagher.
Right. Yeah.
And he was actually at my audition, and it was in a small studio at the depot in North London, and I'm there, and he's sitting there with his mum, literally probably about 3 meters away, on a little couch.
This would have been what, late 90s at the peak of Oasis power kind of thing, or?
No, it was a bit after that. This was 2003. Yeah, that was definitely 03. Yeah, beginning of 03. But they were still there. Liam was But he was sitting, as I say, probably less than 3 meters away, sort of sitting like that. Looking at me like that, and I'm just, he had the big blazer on, everything. Obviously that gives you a little bit of a thing. There's a little nervous thing going on there, and I think we did 4 songs, and at the end of them, I saw him kiss his mum, kiss Nicole, and he's leaving, and he turned around as he went out the door, and he gave this really encouraging sort of signal, like, man, great one, fucking great one, did you go like that, and then that was it. That was the end of that, and then luckily I got the gig, and that evening I got the call and you got the gig. And then the rest that year was history, and got to work with Liam through that. I got to hang with him a lot. So my confidence is building. I'm making more contacts through that year, through 2003. I was also working with a young girl called Amy Stutz, who was signed to Polydor, I think. She had a couple of hits. She's kind of faded away a bit, unfortunately. She's very talented. So I was juggling those two gigs. I had the same tour manager, so that kind of worked out. And then we get into 2004, and there's kind of more of the same. And it was the end of 2004 that I get the call with Duran, and then that really did change everything for me.
Yeah, right. Well, so, lots of hard work, ability, and a little bit of luck that, all those things have to come together, don't they?
Absolutely.
To build the opportunities. Let's talk about setting up recording studios.
Mm-hmm.
I've done it once a couple of years ago. You've done it twice, I believe.
Three times, actually.
3 times.
Yeah.
So Rockwood, obviously, your studio now. Church Row Studios,
yes,
which was also in London.
Yep, that was in Wandsworth.
Wandsworth. I was going to say Wanstead, but Wandsworth. And the third studio was what?
Well, actually, so Rockwood Studios, basically I carried the name on. So that was my second studio, which I built in the back garden of my old house. It was a massive, massive job. It's a big studio. In parts, in places we had to go down 2 meters because of those trees, massive tree roots that had to be. So everything had to be reinforced. It was a big job. But then when I moved, I built this studio where we're in now, and just took the name with me, the Rockwood Studios name.
So tell me about key challenges of setting up a studio and advice that you'd give to anybody who's looking to do a similar thing.
Okay, noise control. Get it soundproofed if you can. My first studio that I built in Wandsworth was Church Row Studios, and that was in a basement of a big sort of office kind of complex. Beautiful old Georgian building, and there wasn't proper soundproofing in that. So occasionally we'd get a few complaints, but that was why I then went and did the Rockwood Studios. But that spot, for instance, wasn't perfectly soundproofed, and I learned from that experience, but the treatment was fantastic. So all of my studios have been treated to the highest spec. And I think that's probably the most important thing. So for anybody, even if you've only got if you're doing it in your bedroom, you're doing it whatever, in your spare room, in your garage, whatever, get it treated. So you're here, I don't need to tell you this, but you want to get you want to get the clearest sound you can get, the most true, honest.
Yeah. So for anybody that doesn't know anything about how sound works, effectively, when you're setting up a studio, there are 2 sorts of sound that you need to be thinking about. There's the sound you hear and the sound anyone else could hear. You want to try and make sure that people outside the studio hear as little as possible, preferably nothing. Mm-hmm. And the sound inside needs to be the best that it possibly can. So, those are two very different things. They require very different methods of construction. One is all to do with, well, I know that your studio there is a floating studio, so floating floor, everything's decoupled, exactly the same as my studio here, floating floor, false ceilings, everything's decoupled. So it's, it's rooms within rooms.
It's a big job, isn't it? It's a
massive job. And, and that's where probably your biggest expense is. The internal acoustic treatment is a lot cheaper than the external, because it's, stuff like these, soft walls, acoustic panels,
exactly,
diffusion, those sorts of things. But that is much cheaper than
it
the
is
actual soundproofing.
It is. And I mean, I had to do, because what I've done, this is a converted shop.
Mm-hmm.
And out the other side there's a main road. You've got buses and lorries going along. But if I hadn't had this floating, you would get the vibrations coming in, you'd get the noise. But I mean, it's silent in here. I can record strings and put compression on it. You don't hear any of the outside noise. But also, there's a flat above, and there's a shop either side. Well, it's detached that side, but that side is a shop. So I had to make sure that what I was doing in here didn't get out as well.
Yeah.
And that's why the floating thing works.
And I'm exactly the same here. I've got a commercial premises in town. I've got a neighbour upstairs. I've got the streets there. I've got the live room and then the street. I've got a restaurant the other side of the wall behind me.
God. So
if the sound isolation is no good, I can't work.
No,
simple as that.
Exactly.
And likewise, I'd be pissing everyone else off. So it's got to be good.
But unfortunately, it's very expensive. It's a whole different ball game to having a loft extension or getting your kitchen extension.
Yeah.
it's a different ball game, isn't it? But worth it if you that's where you want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk to me about equipment, right? Because there's a lot of talk about, studio equipment and gear, and you need this, you've got to have that. It's not a studio without X, Y, Z. For you and how you work, what are the things that you couldn't live without in your studio? Put aside all your guitars. Instruments is a given, but
studio gear. Yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, I've got ATC monitor. I think monitors is really important to get a good monitor system. I've got NS10s and I've got ATC 45s. Obviously, having a great mic or great mics, but if you only can afford one, make sure it's a good mic. Mic if it's just one man if it's one guy in his bedroom doing acoustic guitars, singing, just get a couple of mic. You need a mic specific for guitars and a great vocal mic. Good mic pre's. They're the fundament, and a good interface, obviously.
That's about it, right? Like start with monitoring. Good monitoring is a must. Good mic, good pre, good interface, and you can work.
You can get amazing results from that.
Yeah.
And if you're clever, you can get great results without really expensive gear as well. If you know what you're doing, and you spend the time tweaking things, you can make it work.
Yeah. So how do you, when you're working as producer / engineer for an artist that's coming in to work with you, how do you make sure or do your best to ensure that the environment is inspiring and conducive to creativity? Are there things that you try and do to put artists at ease or to make them feel relaxed?
Yeah, make sure you've got the coffee and tea and on board, for starters. I mean, I like quite a sort of ambient lighting, as you can see. It's actually a bit brighter than it normally is. Small things. I mean, obviously we talked about being prepared, so I like to be prepared so that things run as smoothly technically as possible. Even little things like planning lunch, like establishing, are people going to go next door and get a takeout, or are we going to go? Is everybody going to take an hour out and go down to the cafe and sit and have lunch? For me, that's quite an important thing. Food's quite a big thing in my life. But also, yeah, I think people like to know it. But if it's a client who doesn't really make a big deal about it, and they just want to work straight through, then I'll make sure I'm covered. Snacks and sandwiches at hand and stuff. Yeah, it's just kind of managing those kind of small things like that, I think.
And in that sense, you've got to adapt, right? Because each artist's going to have their own quirks, you could say, and ways in which they'd like to work. So you can't necessarily impose the way that you would prefer to work because they're paying the bill.
Exactly. I mean, I like to try and factor in like an hour's break that they're not paying for. It's just an hour's break, so everybody can have a little chill. So after 4 or 5 hours, go and get some lunch or whatever. But not everybody wants to do that. But most of the time, people are up for that. Again, it's always about being open-minded and compromising, and just trying to make things keep things smooth and fluent.
Yeah. So I want to talk a bit more about your own music, your solo stuff. You've got, is it 2 or 3 solo records?
I've got 3 solo albums and a blues album.
Yeah. So let's talk about those a little bit. So in terms of writing and recording your own music, how does that differ to recording, say, a Duran record?
Interesting. Yeah. So actually, I did my first solo album was 2001, way before I had a studio. And like I was saying, you can get good results with basic gear. I had what was called a Roland VS 1680. I don't know if you know them. There's like a digital 16 track,
like a digital 16
track, with faders and everything like that. And I recorded an album on that. So if I wanted to do drums, I would go to a rehearsal studio and just very sort of basically mic up drums and record them just in some random cheap rehearsal room. That's all that. I mean, obviously, if I'm working with Duran, it's a whole different ballgame, isn't it?
Yeah, big budget.
Yeah, we've worked at Metropolis with Duran, East Coast. But actually saying that, when we started doing Paper Gods, that was around 2015. The guys actually came to my studio with Mark Ronson in Church Road Studios in Wandsworth. So they were there for about 5-6 weeks. That's where we did most of the writing, got some of the basic parts constructed. But then we went to their studio, which is a lot smaller than mine, but they had their gear that they wanted to use to record with, and it was on their time because obviously I wasn't involved with that all that other side of it.
So yeah, three solo records. The most recent was 22. Did you release it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that was my lockdown record. Yeah.
Lockdown record. Because I helped you a little bit towards
Yeah,
the end,
at the end,
with
yeah.
a bit of mixing to finish off.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Finish off that. But you also have a record that you did with your old man, with your dad. What brought that about? What made you and him want to do that record? And, and what have you taken from that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'd never done a blues album before, and I've been playing blues since I was about 18, initially to rock, but then I got into the blues thing. So I was always doing rock, but I had like a blues rock band and a blues band. And when I was about 19, 20, I actually formed a band with my dad. That was pretty much specific blues. There wasn't so much of the rock thing in there.
Mm-hmm.
It crossed over a bit, but with him singing as a frontman, he's a very good frontman actually. It's very funny. He's got a very kind of unique voice in the sort of vein of Tom Waits and Howlin' Wolf, but he's got his own thing going on. And we'd been gigging and writing, and I'd written quite a few blues songs on my own and some with him, and it just seemed like the right time to kind of document that, get that down, get it down on tape. And it was a labour of love. We released that in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a slow thing because I was very busy with Duran. It was quite hard to get my dad to commit because he was busy with his stuff. So, sometimes we wouldn't do anything for a month. Then we'd get together for a day or two, and then we wouldn't do anything for another month. I'll be away for 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And then,
yeah.
So it's one of those, it was a slow process, but really, really fun, and managed to capture a lot of, because the blues is a very broad church within itself. And there's some very authentic kind of classic type blues, and there's a bit more rocky stuff, some funky kind of blues.
Nice.
Quite eclectic.
Yeah, but great that you've got that record down. It'll always feel quite sentimental to you, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's called Blue to Brown. So that's the name of the album and the name of the band, Blue to Brown.
Beautiful. Cool. So I think I would just like to wrap up with getting some advice from you. Is there, if you could give a single lesson, a single piece of advice to any aspiring musicians today about building a sustainable career in the music industry, what would your advice be? Experience
is everything, I think. And that could mean playing in every band that, when you're starting out, when you're young, when you're in your teens, just play with everybody you can. That's one thing. Anybody asks you to do a gig, just find the time and learn the music and do it. And you'll learn so much from that. You get a lot of these guys that come straight out of college and they've never done, music college and stuff. And they've never done an actual live gig. And so that you then put them on a stage and they don't sort of seem comfortable. There's something, especially from a performance point of view, It's experience, but also in the studio as well, try and get as much studio experience, just with doing anything, doing demos for your friends, whatever it is, just so you're getting used to seeing a bit about the process and stuff. Again, being a bit, I've mentioned this a lot, but being open-minded is such a huge asset. It's going to help you. Don't alienate yourself from other musicians and other artists and stuff. And you listen to all kinds of music and find the ones that you love and study those genres. Get your head into it. If it's a funk thing, just spend a few weeks listening to funk and just playing funk. And
those are all great bits of advice. Get the experience, take all the opportunities, be open-minded, study. Yeah, all good.
I like the way you put that, very concisely put. That's it. You've nailed it.
Get the bullet points down at the end.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. No, that's the best advice, isn't it? Just work hard, get as much experience as you can.
Dom, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for finding the time to talk to me today. It's been a real joy to catch up.
My pleasure too, Sam. I wish you'd do it again at some point.
We will.